In this video, I will discuss the SynthEBD Textures and Meshes menu. The assets controlled by this menu are actually not limited to textures and meshes, but can be anything within an NPC's properties that is a text string. But textures are the main use case for EBD. In some places in this video, as well as the SynthEBD README, I use the word assets as a catch-all, but almost all users should just consider this word synonymous with textures. The first checkbox, allow config files to change NPC textures, dictates if your installed config files can change textures. If a config file tries to assign an asset that ends with .dds, unchecking this box will block that change. Similarly, unchecking allow config files to change NPC meshes blocks config files from applying changes if the new text ends in .nif. At the time of recording, only my high-poly vanilla hair configs distribute meshes. Originally, the idea was to pair specific body meshes with corresponding textures, but the development of BodyGen and then OBody deprecated this functionality. The allow config files to change NPC head parts setting controls not the face texture, which is controlled by the first setting, but rather the NPC head part objects. Some config files have replacement textures for head parts, such as my tempered skins configs, which replace default scar textures with the ones from tempered skins. This toggle prevents these replacement head parts from being generated while allowing the rest of the config file, such as face and body textures, to apply. Patch NPCs with custom bodies controls if SynthEBD can patch assets for custom-skinned NPCs. These are NPCs with custom worn armor fields. For example, if you use Bijan War Maidens, the NPCs will have a custom record in their WNAM slots. If this checkbox is disabled, SynthEBD will not patch these NPCs. Therefore, if you want a quick way to disable NPCs with custom skins from getting overwritten by the new skins from your config files, uncheck this toggle. Patch NPCs with custom faces is similar but checks the face texture record. You can see that this is not the case for Bijan, but it can be for some custom skin NPCs. Note that SynthEBD does not count the complexions from the base game as custom faces. You can uncheck both this and the previous checkbox if you want to keep SynthEBD from overwriting the textures of all custom-skinned NPCs. The next toggle, Enable Asset Replacers, controls a particular type of asset that we'll talk about more in the next video. The gist is that asset replacers only apply to NPCs that already have that asset. For example, the tempered skin scar textures that I mentioned before are asset replacers that will only be applied to NPCs that already have those scars with the vanilla textures. A caveat is that while replacers have no additional effect on in-game performance, their distribution can make the SynthEBD patcher run slower. You can disable distribution of asset replacers using this checkbox. Force Vanilla Body Mesh Paths is a setting that makes NPCs use the default vanilla body meshes rather than any custom meshes that a mod author might have given them. The advantage to this is that if you're using BodyGen or Body Slide distribution, you don't need to track down mods such as this one for all of your custom body NPCs. Instead, you can just build zeroed sliders as normal, and all of your NPCs will be patched to use those meshes instead of their original, which can simplify your workflow for body shape assignment. Easy NPC Compatibility Mode makes SynthEBD play nice with Easy NPC. There's no reason to disable this setting even if you're not using Easy NPC, so I recommend you leave it on. The next line has controls for some options regarding the scripts from EBD, which you had to install as a dependency, and which SynthEBD requires to correctly distribute NPC face textures in-game. The first option lets SynthEBD write a fixed version of one of EBD's scripts to your data folder. The original script has a typo that causes NPCs from ESL or ESPFE files to lose their face textures. A user named Pragaset found the typo and volunteered a fix, so SynthEBD can overwrite the original with their version. The script which needed the fix happens to be the one that depends on which version of Skyrim you're running, so if enabled, you'll need to select your SSE version. If you've set your Skyrim version to VR in the General Settings menu, the less than 1.5.97 option should be selected automatically. Next is an option that controls a different EBD script. By default, SynthEBD will distribute its own modified versions. These have been cleaned of functions that the original EBD mod used, but that SynthEBD handles differently. Also, these new scripts have built-in compatibility with some mods that would otherwise reset NPC face textures to their original versions, causing a seam at the neck where the new body textures would still be applied. If you want to still use the original EBD scripts for benchmarking, or another reason, they still work with SynthEBD, and you can check this toggle to use them instead. If you leave that box unchecked to use the new SynthEBD face texture script, you can add events that cause the face texture script to rerun and fix the neck seam using the refresh triggers list. You can see the default triggering mod events in the dropdown here, which reveals one of the mods which causes this bug with the original EBD script. You can add your own, with the major caveat that the triggering events have to match the arguments show here: a string, float, and form. If there's an event that SynthEBD needs to respond to but has different arguments, you'll need to contact me so that it can get hard-coded in. Note that the onNI node update event is also subscribed to by default. Lastly, you can enable the verbose mode. This will make the SynthEBD face texture script write to your Papyrus log if you've enabled logging in your Skyrim INI. You'll also get notifications in-game when the script applies a face texture. Obviously, I'd only recommend this for testing. Note that these last two options are only available if using the new SynthEBD face texture script, rather than the original EBD version, which doesn't have refresh triggers or logging. Generate combination assignment log toggles the writing of the combination log that was discussed in the general settings video. Some users have reported that when very many config files are installed, the patcher can sometimes hang when writing this log. This issue will be investigated, but if you see the patcher stall or crash at the very end, consider unchecking this box. The next option is Show Preview Images. To give you a sneak preview of the next video where we'll discuss the config files themselves, I'll select one for editing. This checkbox toggles the display of texture previews that show which textures are controlled by a given setting. Note that these are converted from .dds on the fly, so they may take a couple seconds to load in. You can also drag the purple separator bar to resize the image. To the right of the checkbox, you can control the resolution of the converted preview image. The bigger the render size, the longer it takes to load the image, and the more memory it takes. So keep this in mind if you're on an older or weaker system. You can set this to a lower value, though the converted image will of course be more blurry. Cache-generated records is a process that SynthEBD does internally. Without it, the patching will be extremely slow, so I would only turn this off if you're troubleshooting an issue where the verbose log says the patcher is doing one thing, but SynthEBD shows it's doing something else. For normal usage, you should never need to disable this. The next section controls asset path trimming. If you look at the asset paths that SynthEBD controls, you can see that they start with the first subfolder beneath Scream's data folder, such as data/textures shown here. But if you look at what actually goes into a .esp plugin, you can see that Skyrim already knows that textures live in the textures folder, so these paths start with the name of the next subfolder down. The path trimming just tells SynthEBD what that first data subfolder is, so that it can get removed from the assigned paths. For example, it will remove textures from the beginning of DDS file paths and meshes from the beginning of NIF file paths. You would only need to edit this if you're introducing assets with a new file type. The active config files list lets you control which config files will be used during patching. If you have a config file that you don't want to use for the current patching run, but you don't want to delete it, just uncheck it in this menu. The distribution order lets you control the order of distribution of primary config files, along with body shape assignment if enabled, and mix in config files. The difference between the two types will be made clear in the next video. The important thing is that if two config files try to overwrite the same texture, the one distributed last will win. Here you can control the distribution order by dragging and dropping the list entries, which go from first at the top and last at the bottom. The Validate Configs button will check all of your enabled config files for errors. Right now it won't find any because I've installed the configs correctly. If I introduce an error by adding a random letter to a file path, which now points to a file that doesn't exist, the validation will catch that error. Split-screen config editor can be useful for config file authors. You can see two different config files side by side, and even drag entries from one to the other. You can also toggle the full-height config editor to hide all of the toggles at the top and give you more screen space to work with for editing your config files. At the bottom, you've already seen the Install Config from Archive button in the installation tutorial videos. The next option is Install Config from JSON file. This does what it says, so I don't recommend it because it won't come with all the bells and whistles of telling you which mod to download and then automatically extracting it to the correct destination folder. You would have to manually extract the texture mod in the correct way. If you previously used SynthEBD, this is basically that old installation functionality. The last real use case for this mode of installation is if there is a SynthEBD config file that hasn't yet been upgraded to SynthEBD format, and you're willing to do the legwork of putting the textures that it's looking for into the correct folder. Otherwise, I strongly recommend installing configs from Archive instead. Create new config file will give you a new blank config file to work with, which may be useful to config file authors. There's also a config packaging menu which provides a UI for config authors to generate the installation tree that end users see when installing a config from an archive. The Simulate Distribution button will run the patcher for the given number of cycles for a selected NPC, and tell you which assets were assigned, and with what frequency. Here, for example, I ran it on my current setup for Ayla the Huntress, and it's telling me that Bijan skins will never be assigned, and she will always get textures from tempered skins. You can see all the counts for the different texture variants, and ones with 0 will be highlighted in red. The Y button next to each asset will tell you why it was or wasn't assigned. Note that this is a pretty simple parser that will just try to read the verbose log and pull out the relevant text. Sometimes the parser will fail to find the line, in which case you would have to run the patcher and read the generated verbose log to figure out why a given texture is or isn't getting assigned to your NPC. A couple additional settings were added after the main video was recorded. The Match NPC Skin Alternate Textures is for patching NPC armor and clothes to incorporate their new texture if they previously used the original texture, which is the case for some revealing armor and clothing. The Match NPC Armor Textures patches an armor's alternate textures list in the same way, replacing the previous body texture with the newly assigned one. While the first setting does have an effect in-game, alternate textures controlled by the latter seems to be ignored by the game engine if a primary skin texture is assigned, so it should be safe to turn off if you want to save a second or two of patching time. That's it for the textures and meshes options. See you in the next video where we will discuss the config files themselves and how to edit texture distribution rules.